Hello, beautiful humans. Welcome to the Midlife Revolution. I'm your host, Megan Connor, and today I am joined by the inimitable and revolutionary Britt Hartley. Britt, thanks for being with us today.
My pleasure.
Now, you can find Britt all over the internet. She recently published a book called No Nonsense Spirituality, which I highly recommend for anybody who is questioning religion or coming out of religion. It's got some wonderful tools in there, and I've gone back and reread sections of it several times just to sort of let it soak into my brain. So I love your book. Britt's also on TikTok. And where I first found you, I think I told you already, is on your Mormon Stories episode that aired about 7 months ago. And I think it was just a couple of months before that I was sort of in a nihilistic space. And then I found your video on Mormon Stories, and so much of it resonated with me because I'd been through some of the same things. And it was the beginning of me having language for what I was going through spiritually. And so I highly recommend that video. I'm going to put that link in the show notes as well. And then there are a couple of more videos on Mormon Stories and actually all over the podcasting universe about your book and things like that. So everybody can learn everything they want to know about Britt from that. So Britt, I just want to ask you, what would you like to share with people today? What's on your mind?
That's a good question. Recently, I guess I've been wrestling with this idea of how much truth is good for us. I've kind of been exploring that idea lately. So, for those who don't know me, I had a big just deconstruction journey that lasted about a decade by the time I had really deconstructed and ended up in a place like you said called, nihilism, where I couldn't really make sense of things. I didn't have a sense of my own meaning and purpose. I didn't have tools to deal with things like death and suffering, and life just got really, really dark really fast for me. And then since then, a lot of my work has been finding tools for that space, not just for me, but also now for others. But something that I've been really wrestling with is this idea that Nietzsche talks about, which is that we have art because if we just had truth, it would kill us, something like that. And I've been really thinking about some of these harsh truths that we have to face as humans, um, and how much of that we can psychologically handle, and how much we can expect people to be able to psychologically handle, and how many tools we actually really have for people to psychologically handle these things. So, those are the kinds of deep, dark, deep end of the pool things that I like to think about. For me, honesty about hard, honest, dark places of the human experience, even though they're hard things, just being honest and talking about those things just brings me a lot of joy in some paradoxical way, because it just feels real to me. It feels real to me to like really get at the base level of what's going on with our human experience.
Yeah, I love that. And it resonates so much with me. I saw a video that you posted on TikTok about how much truth is good for us as human beings. And me having a very strong part of myself that is a truth teller and that sort of wants to tell all the truth, I want it to be measured too with some compassion. And that's one of the reasons I wanted to have this conversation with you, because I sometimes get myself into trouble telling too much truth. And by trouble, I mean good trouble, the kind of John Lewis trouble that, it's eye opening for some people. And when I was going through sort of my journey with my family, I felt like I had been lied to for so much of my life that I did not want to be lied to anymore about anything. And that's why I ended up where I ended up, because I wanted to investigate all of these hard questions myself and come up with some answers. But I also think it can be dangerous. And I know you know some about that. So can you talk about how that's dangerous for us as human beings?
Sure. So I'll give an example. So for example, when we look at the free will question, now I can't know for sure. So when I say truth, I mean this is the best that I've figured out. I'm not claiming really anything about ultimate reality anymore. I don't even know if we're interacting with ultimate reality. Um, I more mean just this is the answer to the question as best I've been able to kind of put it together. So when you look at the question of free will, how I see it based on kind of really studying it and the neuroscience and Robert Sapolsky and philosophically and the physics of it, I can't see a way where we have something like free will. Now, what can happen to us psychologically if we really take in a harsh truth like that, that we do not have as much free will as we think that we do, and we're more or less kind of doing a cause and effect kind of situation. And if we were to rewind time, we would just kind of still end up here having this conversation. It can be really psychologically disorienting for people. People can start to feel like they're a robot. People can start to feel like they don't have any control. We've also seen studies where you can move people through the arguments that they don't have free will, and we can watch that their morality will go down. We can also watch that their motivation will go down. This is the one thing that Robert Sapolsky is really worried about with telling people that they don't have free will. He thinks we can kind of figure out the justice system, we can redefine society. But one thing that we can't figure out yet is that when people really accept that they don't have free will, they tend to not have the motivation, for example, to become a brain surgeon. Because if you become a brain surgeon, you spend 15 years in school, you kind of have to have this belief that you're a self and that you're smart and you deserve this amount of money and you're going to put in this work and you did it. And there's a lot of kind of self-driven kind of things going on in your brain to get you to put in the work to become a brain surgeon. Now, if you take all of that away by saying actually the self is an illusion and we don't have free will, people tend to not be as motivated to go into the kind of work that you'd need to do to be a brain surgeon. And so these are the things that I think about. These are harsh truths about God or the nature of reality or the self or free will, where maybe, like for you and I, we once had a nice, cushy answer to some of these questions that made us feel really nice and warm and fuzzy, that we knew who we were and we knew what we were here to do and we know what's going to happen after we die. And it's a nice security blanket. And if you have an identity as a truth seeker, which is, one of many core values you can have, but it's especially common in Mormonism where we're really taught to seek after the truth, then it can be really disorienting when you're going after these questions and finding either no answer or really hard to take answers, not nice, warm, fuzzy answers. And so when that happens, it becomes this situation of how much truth is good for you? How much truth can we handle? Is it better? I mean, there's conversations now where is it better to live in the Truman Show? Is it better for a certain percentage of humanity to believe in a God because it's a better shortcut to these things of well-being than to have to build it on your own? These are really they're tough questions. And I think the best that we can do in this space, and I share this with you, is that I don't want, because of my past as a Mormon, I don't want to live in a delusion, even one that I choose because it feels nice. Whatever is reality, I want to face it because I've been bamboozled before and I remember what that felt like and I don't want to do that again. I want it, whatever is real. Whatever that harsh truth is, I want to be able to face it. But in order to do that, we need more tools than we currently have. We need a lot of tools to face our existential fears, fear of meaninglessness, fear of isolation, fear of freedom, fear of death. We don't just stumble upon those tools. We need tools to help us psychologically handle truths that we weren't meant to handle. There's a reason evolutionarily that we have the illusion of a self. There's a reason evolutionarily that we created stories to make us not afraid of death, because we function better with those stories. And so if we're going to cut against that grain, and face some of these harsh truths about reality, we need better tools. And that's kind of what I've dedicated, my work to now, is those tools for myself, because I still need those tools, and also helping others in that space find tools to be able to face those harsh truths and actually have those enemies become friends.
Yeah, and it's interesting you talk about the existential fears. Obviously, we don't have enough time in the universe to talk about all of them thoroughly, but I do think that some people may not really understand what existential fear is or the definition of that. So maybe we can just go through each of them like really briefly and just say a little blurb about what each of those fears are.
Sure. So I'm quoting the work of Irvin Yalom, who's a Buddhist psychoanalyst who was really noticing that humans had these similar fears, and he did a lot of research on it. The first one is fear of death, and this one has been the most well documented, especially with terror management studies, which are studies that show how much of our subconscious, sometimes consciously, but a lot of our subconscious brain is really working on dealing with the fact that we're going to die and dealing with the fact that people around us are going to die, and finding really creative and cute ways to either delude ourselves from it or be able to handle it or have stories to be able to handle it. Or, we have studies that show that if you remind judges that they're going to die and you kind of run them through a mortality exercise before they have their docket of cases, that they tend to be more harsh in their pronouncements
Hmm.
because they subconsciously they are attaching themselves to the law, that the law is bigger than them, and then the law then is something bigger than them that will outlive them. So by attaching themselves to the law, it's actually a way that we subconsciously cheat death because we're a part of something that's bigger than us. So we usually, we have two ways to deal with death. We either find a nice bedtime story that makes us feel better about it, which is kind of, a drug. You and I have both been to Mormon funerals where we sing the same songs and we tell the same story, and we kind of take this collective drug together that grandma's with Jesus now. And it's kind of a spiritual bypassing way to get through it. Um, and the other way to deal with death is to actually face it and to actually sit with the fact that you're going to die. It's scary. You kind of almost die in that moment when you truly face it. And then there are hidden benefits through going through that journey. You become a lot more grateful. You become a lot more focused. You become a lot more authentic. You become a lot more compassionate. So, so that would be fear of death, and there's lots of tools for facing death, and there's various things that people are afraid of around death. The next one would be fear of freedom, which is
Let
the
me
one that
let me
people.
pause just
Go
one
ahead.
second.
Yeah, please.
I want to rewind just a little bit.
Yeah.
So, talking about the Mormon concept, and I don't think it's unique to Mormonism, but one of the things I think that is unique to Mormonism is that Mormon funerals are not generally about honoring the person who has passed away. They're
No.
about repeating to ourselves the stories that we've told ourselves that give us comfort about death and meaninglessness.
Yes.
So I always found that really interesting in the way that I was like, why is it that we don't really talk about the person? It's about honoring their life and celebrating their life. I think a lot of it too is because there's so much focus on the afterlife that we're constantly preparing for the afterlife, that we cheat ourselves of this existence and we almost dismiss it as unimportant in some ways. And we
Mm,
sort of check our little boxes and think that as long as we're doing that, then we're going to have a much better afterlife. And when I finally left Mormonism and deconstructed the idea of an afterlife, I found that my life here had so much more meaning to me. And I was so
yes.
much more able to enjoy all of the experiences and savor all of the experiences because I'm not reserving my joy for some future time.
Yeah, that Mormon funeral, really at the level of the brain, it is acting like a collective drug. That we
Mhm.
sing this song and we tell this story. We cry a little bit, but not too much because they're in a better place now, and we just keep telling ourselves that, so we bypass that grief. And it really is acting like a communal drug. Let's come together and take this drug together, right?
Yeah.
And actually grieving death, like, it's like you kind of you breezed over that to the good stuff, but actually facing that someone is gone and you don't know if you're ever gonna see them again, I mean, that's not easy. Like, that really crushes you. That really, and our brain is almost in shock. How can someone who I was just talking to yesterday truly be gone, right? And that grief is harder than taking the drug. It's gonna hurt, but the benefit are all those benefits that you just, alluded to so beautifully, that, your life becomes a lot more precious. You don't have to kind of take that drug or bypass that pain. You can actually move through it. You can actually put things in your life to remember that person rather than just kind of trying to move on, which is what we do with a lot of funerals. We just kind of try to bypass the grief. Um, but really trying to keep that person alive by doing something that they do or continuing a ritual or a tradition actually keeps them alive in the world in a way that's really profound. So it is harder to not take that drug, but there are more benefits in being able to move through that human experience. But we need
Yeah.
tools to go through that hard place, or we're gonna shy away from it because it's crushing.
It's too scary to face because we don't
Yes.
really know how to process it, and we don't really know how to move past it. So you're right, the
Yes.
tools are super, super important. Okay, so what's the next one?
Next one, fear of freedom, which is the one that kind of confuses people at first, which is, the genuine fear that we have that we are responsible for our own lives. And you would think that we want freedom. We give a lot of lip service that we want more freedom, we want more choices, we want more autonomy, but in actuality, in our human nature, we actually don't want that much because it's scary to actually say you are responsible for your life and you are also capable of truly effing your life up. Like that is possible. And that's really scary. So the reality is, we a lot of people say if we could just be free of all these cults and cult leaders and political leaders and gurus, then we could have freedom and we could be free without these dictators running around. But the reality is, if all of them died today, we would recreate all of them tomorrow because there's something really alluring to human nature, to someone who looks really competent, looks like they have their shit together, saying, I have the 12 steps for your perfect life. And we go, oh my God, thank you so much. Because otherwise, we're really lost. It's hard to be a human. And I think the lie of atheism sometimes is that if you just leave religion, you'll just like stumble upon the good life. You'll stumble upon your most meaningful, authentic, fulfilling life. And I don't think that that's true. I think that we need a lot of help. And so fear freedom is this internal fear that we have that we are responsible, but that it's very scary because we don't know what to do, and we're just trying to figure out how to be human in this world. We have more questions than we have answers to, and it's hard. And so we need tools, but also we need to be aware that we are susceptible to creating leaders and to following leaders and to giving our authority away to leaders. A lot of people like to blame politics and blame religion, but we create them. We create them because of our fear of freedom. And so working in that space is really about getting in touch with who you are, really figuring out who you are and your core values and what resonates with you and what calls you and what is meaningful to you, and making small steps in that direction and kind of building self-trust along the way so that you're not susceptible to the next cult, which you and I both see with people leaving religion, that they'll jump from something like Mormonism and they'll jump headfirst into, I don't know, I'm a witch now, or I'm an anti-theist, and Christopher Hitchens is my new prophet, or whatever the thing is. We tend to want to cult because it soothes our fear of too much freedom.
Yeah, that's so, so, so true that if we destroy whatever system's in place now, we're going to rebuild one. Because I've been talking a lot lately about how hardwired we are in our DNA towards survival, and how that really drives everything that we're doing, and that even our emotional responses are a part of our survival. And because of that, we want to conserve resources as much as we can, we as human beings. And so we're going to seek for the easiest option, whether it's the easiest psychologically or the easiest
Mm,
physically, because that conserves our resources if we need them for survival. And the easiest option is always just to have somebody tell us what to do, tell
mhm,
us how to live our lives, tell us what morality is. And I see it so much in the internet social media culture, where rather than doing their own critical thinking, people will see a post that resonates with them and they'll just repost it without thinking about how it applies to anything in their lives. They just say, oh, I like that idea, and they repost it. And then they're surprised when they get pushback or comments that disagree with it. And they're like, why would you disagree with me? Everybody thinks this way because we've
Mm,
created these echo chambers for ourselves online where we only follow people we agree with. We only listen to or read or consume podcasts of people that we agree with. And it's because it's so much harder to listen to other ideas different than our own and expend the mental energy that it takes to absorb them and consider them and decide whether or not they apply to our lives. So just as you say, this fear of freedom is really about, let me conserve my brain power and have someone else just tell me how to live my life. And it's really hard to break away from that and start to realize that we are the ones who make all those decisions for ourselves.
mhm. Yeah, and this is where you really have to, like you're saying, you really have to cut against your biases, because we're not these blank slates that just take in information and make rational decisions. We are really emotional creatures, and we're highly biased, which means if you are not actively trying to get out of your echo chamber, like purposefully following people that challenge your beliefs, if you're not doing that intentionally, your bias, even without choosing it, your bias will be kind of the flow of the river, is that you will end up in an echo chamber because it feels safe. Like you say, it
Mhm.
feels safe. This is the answer. These are the good guys. These are the bad guys. And like you say, there are evolutionary reasons why that feels really safe for us to have an in group and to really follow the leader of our in group who has signals of competence. And there are reasons that our brain tends towards that direction. So if you want to not be that, if you want to be able to say, I'm a critical thinker and I'm actually thinking about this and I'm not just being driven by an echo chamber, then you actually have to intentionally do that, or else your brain's just going to end up there without you even trying, without you even making the decision.
Right. And I don't know if you find this to be true, but for me, it's exhausting work. And I can listen to something for about an hour before I stop processing and it sort of turns off. So I have to like set it aside and really meditate and consider the ideas that I'm hearing, because it's so much mental energy to really dig into that and absorb it. And I just recently had to say, just give myself some grace for that, because I'm like, well, I can't go to the gym and work out for 12 hours a day, nor can I mentally put myself in a
Mm,
space where I'm considering other people's ideas for a very long time. So it's like I've started to do it in short little exercises instead
yeah.
of expecting to read a whole book and be able to get through it.
Yeah. And I think that that's really wise, because some people will say, they'll talk about the suffering of the world, for example, but if you're just laying down watching documentaries of the worst things that have ever happened to people, to where you're just on the couch every day crying, um, which we can do, like, we can do that, but is that actually helping the amount of suffering in the world? Or is that feeling it to the point that you're of no use to anyone? And so I think it's okay to say, like, this is my limit. I'm taking as much as I can here. Because the point is, if we're trying to reduce suffering because suffering is bad, if we can at least get there, then we do have limits to how much we can feel and how much we can think about these things and how much we can function, thinking about these things. Because the other thing that we have to get really comfortable with, if you're not going to be in an echo chamber, is that you really have to get comfortable with, I don't know. Like, I don't know. I've listened to this debate. There was good points on both sides. I don't really know. And you have to sit with that. And more you have to get comfortable with this idea of, I don't know, it's complex. And the wisest people I know, if you ask them a question about something, they don't just like whatever the political party answer of that side narrative is, they don't run into it. They'll say it's complicated. I don't really know. It's really complicated. Those are, if you ask someone a question and they say it's complicated, that person understands what's going on. The person who says it's this is the right answer, these are the wrong, the wrong answers, blah blah blah. That's something someone hasn't been thinking in that space. They're just following a narrative. If someone says it's complicated, those I feel like are the wisest people.
Yeah, I agree with that. Those are my people. And maybe we're not going to get to talk about the other existential fears, and we sort of visited a little before this, that we're just going to let the conversation go where it goes. But going back to something that you said earlier about justice, about seeking justice, and the judges tend to be harsher when they're reminded that they're going to die, it reminded me of just what you're talking about, something complicated that I've been contemplating the last little while, that I'm curious about your thoughts about the death penalty, because in the contemplation of that concept, cannot find a difference between justice and revenge.
Mm.
And that's an idea that I borrowed from another person that I was listening to, but I included that in my contemplation because being in a position where I was witnessing, a trial where it was consequential to me personally, I believed that what I thought was right was the death penalty. A life for a
Mm.
life, it makes sense to us. And especially in my case where children were involved, I thought that that's what was right and that's what I wanted. And after the sentence was pronounced, I felt so hollow and so empty and so
Mm.
alone. And this is so emotional for me because I still haven't figured it out. And it is so complicated. Um, and I just got to the point where right now, in this moment, I have no idea what the right answer is, but
Mm.
it's still part of my contemplation. So I'm really curious to know what you think.
Yeah, that's a really good question, and you're right. The majority of the pro-death penalty in our country is really driven by this, especially Christian retributive justice. You know, eye for an eye. You need to be punished. Justice is you get what you deserve, kind of thing. And most of our arguments around having the death penalty is really a form of revenge, that you did this and you shouldn't have done it, so we're going to do it to you. And me the hard thing is there truly are some people, and we don't even have to blame these people, if we don't believe in free will, who are given such a bad deck, of life to deal with, that they not only had mental issues, like sometimes schizophrenia or these other things, but then also just a significant amount of trauma, no empathy, um, really, really rough psychology, and we don't have the tools, we don't have a medication to give this person for them to be able to have the amount of empathy you need to be in a society. And so you have to remove these people from society, and there's just no way kind of around it with the tools that we have. And maybe in a perfect world, we could truly know that someone is going to always cause harm and kill other people and be a damage in a prison, and we know that they're guilty, and it's a compassionate thing to do, to just to end their life because they can't play in the playground with the rest of us. And maybe in a perfect world, there's a way that you could ethically justify it. But to me, there's just too many ethical problems with the state having enough power to kill people. And we are too biased to be able to really handle that kind of power ethically. So, for example, Illinois got rid of their death penalty because they looked back and said 12 out of the 13 um, death penalties that they had where it was overturned, they were wrong. 12 out of 13 of those was because the person was Black. And so essentially, Illinois as a state said, we are too biased to have this kind of power to make decisions about someone's ultimate kind of ability to be able to function in society. We are far too biased as people to be able to handle that kind of power. So we're relinquishing that power. And it's actually cheaper, by the time you do all the court cases to do a death penalty, it's actually cheaper to keep them alive in prison indefinitely. So for me, for practical reasons, due to human nature, financial reasons of how much it's costing to remove this person from society, and because I don't believe in free will, and so it's really a bad deck of, a bad hand that this person was dealt in some way that we weren't able to help them with. I tend away from the death penalty, but maybe in a perfect world there'd be a way to do that ethically. I just don't think we live in that world.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I think that when there are so many different complicated human emotions involved in the justice system, and so many different levels, from the people who investigate the case and collect evidence, to the people who then analyze the evidence, to the people who then present the evidence in court, to the panel of jurists, to the judge. There are so many complicated factors in there that I don't think it's possible to really have what we as human beings believe is an ideal of justice,
Yeah.
where it really is totally equitable. And
Mm.
this idea of fairness that I don't believe exists either, So I appreciate you saying that, because it does make me feel better about the way that I feel about it. I think what I got to that was hard for me to wrestle with is this idea that when you condemn someone to die, you're essentially giving up on them as a human being. You're saying that there's no possible way that they could ever be redeemed. And I think when we do that for one person, we do it for all of us. It's
Mm.
like saying for all of us that there's an end to how much better you can become as a human being. There's an end to how much you can grow or develop, and that there's a place that you can get to where you just don't change anymore. And I think that's scary too. And maybe that needs to
Mm.
be added to the list of existential fears, the fear of
Yeah. I do think that
stagnation.
there are people who have the kind of psychology that they truly are not going to change, and it
Mhm.
would be like if there was a dog that was just going around biting children, we would actually put the dog down in the most humane way possible. But the
Right.
difference there, and I think you're pointing to it, is that we don't hate the dog. Like, we don't say, like, "Take that dog." It's a
Yeah.
sad thing that for whatever reason, this dog didn't get the proper conditioning in childhood to be able to not bite people for, maybe that dog was abused. And so out of compassion for the dog, that this dog is gonna have a hard life and is also causing harm to others, it needs to be put down in the most ethical way possible. That doesn't feel charged to me. That doesn't feel
Right.
like "F you" to me, right? That comes from a genuine place of compassion. And I think you're right that when it comes to humans and human errors and things like murder, it's very difficult to have that kind of just truly compassionate, empathetic form of justice that isn't driven also by revenge and bias and lots of other things going on. And it just becomes too complex for us to feel like we can competently say this is just like the dog situation. We're just too emotional and too biased for that.
Yeah. What do you think of the idea that we have more compassion for the dog because we don't see ourselves in the dog, but we
Yeah.
have a lack of compassion for criminals because we see ourselves in the criminals? We see our shadow side reflected back at us, and it scares us.
Yeah, there's some of that going on, but I also think that there's a free will aspect going on too, that we feel like the person could have chosen different and should
Mhm.
have chosen different.
Mhm.
Whereas the dog or the bear attacking someone, um, we just feel like that's what animals do. This is a wild, undomesticated animal
Mhm.
that wasn't conditioned properly and is a danger to humans. And so we just kind of have compassion for that because we can sense that dogs will bite, like that's not outside of normal dog behavior. You have to be
Right.
conditioned out of that. So I also think that there's a free will aspect going on because I do find that people who accept that we don't have free will do tend to be more compassionate and have much more of that "it's just like a dog who needs to be put down" kind of response, that you feel bad for the person because they got a rough hand, they got dealt with a rough hand. We still may need to remove that person, but we don't do it with so much hatred that they should have done differently.
Yeah.
So some of that, also I think comes into the feeling that humans have more choices than animals and should have made a different choice.
Mhm. Yeah, that's really great. Thank you so much for unpacking that with me a little bit.
Yeah, yeah.
I think we can move on to the third
Okay.
existential fear.
Yeah, this is just giving us like a good just backbone of things to jump into for this conversation. So the third
Yeah.
fear is fear of isolation. And that's a lot of sometimes that comes after our fear of freedom, where we realize that our path of life, our core values, what speaks to us, what resonates with us, our biases, all the things that makes us us, is truly unique. And in that way, there's a certain amount of mourning that happens, that the world that you live in is truly unique. The way that you see and experience the world, no one else is experiencing it just like you. And there's something kind of sad about that, that we are essentially, in some ways, very alone. There's no one else who knows what it's like to be me. And there's no one else who can kind of look at my life. This is something that was sad for me. No one can fully understand the things that I faced and the questions that I faced and the challenges that I've had. And so no one can tell me truly if I'm doing a good job or not, if I'm doing the right thing or not. And that's hard, and that's really lonely, and that's really isolating. And because of that fear of freedom, this is why we so easily will contort ourselves to fit in a group, because it gives us the illusion that we're not alone when really we are. And so going through the fear of isolation, when we process it, when we have tools to deal with it, something very paradoxical happens, which is that we actually can become closer to people because we learn how to be alone together. And the beautiful thing that happens when you truly sit with yourself without distraction, without having to change yourself, really sitting with yourself, is that it can make you much more honest, and kind of impel you to take more risks in social situations, where you take off your mask and you say, as a mother, actually, I'm really struggling and I'm having intrusive thoughts that are really scaring me. And once in a while, I'll think of something really violent towards my kids, and it scares me and it gives me a lot of shame. Now,
Mhm.
that's something that is true for so many women, including myself.
Yeah.
But saying that out loud is very socially taboo, because we like to think that the moment that we're snuggling on our mother's chest, that our mother is feeling what we're feeling as children, which is just love and safety. We
Mhm.
don't want to feel like in that moment, actually, our mom is in a moment where she wants to die and she wants to jump out of that window because she's so sleep deprived and she has psychotic rage and she has all these things going on with her brain. And so it's incredibly social taboo to even say that out loud. And yet, when you process the fear of isolation and you realize that you are alone in some ways, it can help you to take that risk in a social situation, in a mom group, and say, actually, I'm really struggling with intrusive thoughts. And then in a moment, just by someone else taking off their mask, it gives permission for everyone in the group to take off their mask too. And all of a sudden, it's a group of women crying together, actually being honest about their struggles, about being a mother, and how they weren't prepared for how hard it was going to be and how much of their identity they were going to lose. And I've seen those conversations take a shift because someone was brave enough to take off that mask. And then all of a sudden, these women are best friends and they're texting each other all the time and they're there for each other, just because one person took that step into authenticity. And so that can happen as a benefit of going through this fear of feeling alone, and having that change you to the point that you're more willing to be vulnerable. And then paradoxically, you find that you're not as alone as you think you are. And you actually can find deeper connections, even though no one still will know what it's like to actually be me. I've found that by taking those risks into authenticity and vulnerability, that many people are going through things that I went through that I thought that I was alone in. So no one knows exactly what my postpartum experience was like, but a lot of people had a lot of the same thoughts that I did. And no one knows exactly what, my nihilism experience was like, but a lot of people end up in the place that we call the void and struggle with it. And so going through that fear can really help open up relationships that you didn't even know was possible, like the level of honesty that you didn't know was possible. And that's really beautiful.
It is beautiful, and I'm so glad that you shared that, because I think some people, well, all of us initially were afraid to be our real selves. We sort of do this group think thing and we mimic each other's behaviors and clothing styles and hairstyles and all of that as a means of belonging. And it's one of the reasons why my very first episode in my podcast was called Alone, because I
Mhm.
think the most powerful things that I learned about myself and about society and about how I wanted to show up as a human being happened when I was alone and I contemplated all of these different questions. And I had this ability to sit with myself for the first time, because I had just been on autopilot. I'd been on a treadmill. I was programmed to do a certain thing and to check certain boxes. And it wasn't until I hit the stop button on the treadmill and decided to step off and be alone that I was able to really consider these questions that ultimately led me to a happier life, because there were so many things in my life and so many ways I was expending energy that were draining me rather than filling me up. And I couldn't get to that place until I was truly, totally 100% alone. And for me, it was when I got divorced, and it was my first night without my kids after 20 years of being a mom. And I was like, who am I even if I'm not a mother?
Yeah.
What do I
Yeah.
even do if I'm not fixing lunches for tomorrow and putting laundry in all of that kind of stuff? It was like, who even am I? And I
Mm.
loved this quote by Maya Angelou where she said, I don't belong anywhere until I belong everywhere and nowhere. And then she
Mm.
went on to talk about that, and then she said, I belong to myself.
Mm.
And I don't think we overcome the fear of isolation until we belong to ourselves and we
Yes.
realize just what you're saying, that even though nobody has the exact experiences that I have had, because I belong to myself, I honor those experiences in myself. And
Mhm.
then I find places to connect where people have similar experiences, even if they're not
Yes.
exactly the same.
Perfect. Beautiful. Put it on a T-shirt.
A little long for a t-shirt.
It's a
Don't
little long
want
for a
someone
T-shirt.
staring at me for that long.
Yeah. I have nothing to add to that. You really summed that up just perfectly for me.
Thanks. I think also the other thing that I contemplate in isolation is that, coming back to that concept of truth telling, that truth telling is a really lonely space,
Mm.
because there aren't very many people who are willing to look at something honestly, because it's too hard. It hurts too
Yeah.
much. It's too painful. What can you say about that experience? How do we get to the point where we're willing to radically accept what is true rather than continuing to take these drugs?
Yeah. And this will lead us also into our next existential fear, which is fear of meaninglessness, because one of the big antidotes to the fear of meaninglessness is telling the truth and having kind of truth lead the way into a life that is fundamentally worth living for you. So, fear of meaninglessness is our fear that ultimately whatever we do is really ultimately meaningless. Eventually the sun's going to go out and our earth's going to blow up and the universe doesn't care and there'll be no record of any of this and none of this will have mattered. And especially when you come from religion where you're used to some kind of like grand overarching story, that can be really disorienting because then it's like, what's the point? What's the point of all of this suffering? Why not just push the big red button and to end all this? Because what is truly the point to any of this? And this was the one that really challenged me the most. Usually, at least one of these fears will kind of scare you more than others, and this was the fear that truly almost killed me. And one of the ways that we combat this fear, and I've heard philosophers use different language, but it's essentially the same message, which is that if life is sandcastles and you know the wave's going to come in and take it anyway, if you are in the mindset that I'm going to make a sandcastle that's going to last forever and it's going to be so meaningful, then you're not going to build sandcastles when you realize that the wave always comes and you're just going to not do anything. But if you build sandcastles purely for the childlike joy and wonder of seeing what happens when you flip that bucket over and you put your little flag on it, you make a little moat, and you're just so in the experience that it's meaningful in and of itself. That's the antidote to meaninglessness. It's not finding meaning in some grand story that matters 10,000 years from now. It's finding meaning in the way that we did as children, where we were building sandcastles, not caring that it wouldn't last forever, but because we were so excited to try to do the challenge of building a moat. And when the wave comes in and the water kind of surrounds the castle, you can see children just full of joy, just pure joy, even though that sandcastle will eventually, crumble in an hour or two. And so the shift to move into that space where life is meaningful in the experience of it, in the ride of it, takes a lot of truth telling. And one of the benefits of going through the place that we've been through, where it's really dark and you feel really alone and you're really lost, is that it forces you to be honest about what that life looks like for you. Because pretense and ego and accomplishments and your parents being proud of you or not proud of you, all of that is meaningless when you're really in the void, facing meaningless. And so the only thing that can survive that place is your deepest truths about what matters. So for me, it was, I don't know what's going on with ultimate reality. I'm alone. I'm going through this, but I know that my children, that they matter. And I don't care that the universe doesn't care about them. If it's their first day of kindergarten, even if we're the only life in the universe that eventually goes out, or whatever's going on with reality, I know that them looking for my face after their first day of kindergarten and finding me and lighting up, that moment is meaningful no matter what's going on ultimately. And so that was my first piece, was that my children mattered, and I could feel that they mattered, and I cared about their experience in the world. And then I started to build more into that. I care about reducing suffering. I care about helping people be able to leave religion and do it with more tools than I was able to do it. So hopefully their journey is easier than mine was. That gives me a lot of meaning and purpose when people tell me that I've made their journey easier in some way. Um, Conversations like this just fill me up with so much joy, not because this conversation is necessarily going to change the world, but just because I'm so enjoying resonating with you and being honest with you in this space. And so I started adding to things of, what are the sandcastles that I enjoy building just for the sake of building them, just for the experience. And the shift of moving into that for my meaning versus looking for ultimate meaning really did save my life and change my life. In the course of 2 years, I had a new career as an atheist spiritual director, which is a title that I made up just because this is the work that I want to do. Um, and my relationships changed and my friendships changed, and what I do with my time changes. And I started saying no to more things and saying yes to the things that I wanted to do. And it takes a lot of truth telling and honesty to really map out what that path looks like for you. And then your life can get better when you're in that dark place. It truly can.
Well, I'm just over here crying because I'm resonating with so much of what you're saying. And it's a beautiful thing to contemplate. The sandcastle idea for me, especially lately, has been just the appreciation of nature and the world in general. And I put up this little video a couple days ago. I was so grateful to be able to take this little trip with my partner. We went to Colorado, and I'd been to Colorado, but I'd never really spent like a ton of time. And we went to Rocky Mountain National Park, and it was a life-changing day. Oh, sorry. Because I was just spending time looking at beautiful things I'd never seen before. And as we were leaving the park, the sun was coming through the clouds in this way that I had never seen before. It was these great rays of sunshine shining on the mountains and shining on the river. And I told him, like, stop the car, I have to get out. And I got out and I just started taking pictures and videos, and the wind was blowing everywhere. And Samuel got out of the car and he's like, what are you doing? And I said, just look at all of this. Look at how beautiful it is. When are you ever going to see the light like this again? And the sandcastle for me, I'm going to have to go back and re-record this. But I'm not going to, because I want to prioritize authenticity. Just watch me cry,
Yes.
everybody.
Yes.
In fact, please cry. Please cry along with me. The sandcastle for me is the realization that every experience that I have is the only time anybody's ever going to have that experience. Every time I look at that mountain, the colors are going to be different because of the time of the day and the season of the year and what the weather is doing that day. And the idea that there are an infinity of experiences just like that one that are both totally unique and also the same in so many ways. How do we get to the point where that's what life is for me right now?
Mm,
There's so much I still don't understand, but at least I have the savoring of those really unique moments that I can hold on to.
yes. And if those I don't think maybe it's reasonable to say I've never at least met someone who's in that moment all the time, because then it almost becomes meaningless in a different way. Like if every moment is equally meaningful, maybe it all loses its meaning in some way.
Yeah,
But increasing the amount of experiences you have like that, where you snap out of your neuroticism and you see what's happening, like you truly see it, just like you see the sun and you realize that there's just some preciousness in this moment that we're never going to see again. We can actually improve that. So maybe we're never perfect at it. Maybe we're never crying with, just 100% of our day crying with how much meaning it is. I don't even know if it's, good to be overfilled with that much meaning. But I do think we can increase those experiences, and you can build your life around waking yourself up to that reality. And this is why in spirituality, there's always kind of images of eyes everywhere in almost every religion, including in the Mormon temples. There'll be an eye, all-seeing eye somewhere in some of our temple buildings. And it shows up everywhere in spirituality because it's this whisper of, hey, if you can snap out of what your brain's neurotically obsessing about right now, if you can wake up and see there's something really beautiful happening here. Your child just asked you to pick them up, and yes, your back hurts, but actually you don't know that this is the last time they're going to ask you to do that, because the next time that they ask, they're going to be too heavy,
yeah,
right? And
yeah.
as a
As
mother, like that just makes me weep and just hold that child and just grab that child, and all of a sudden this chore of my toddler kind of pulling up at me becomes this incredibly sacred moment. And we can actually get better. I have reminders around me all the time to wake up, wake up. And one that I use is in the shower. So I tend towards depression. I tend towards neuroticism by nature. So these things are not easy for me. There are some people who move through nihilism and they're like, oh, I'm going to create meaning and life is so beautiful and great. And they just literally just go right to that place because life is great. I was not one of those people. I needed a lot of tools and a lot of help because I'm pessimistic and skeptical and broody and neurotic and all of the things. And so for something like taking a shower, most of the time when I'm taking a shower, if I'm not paying attention, I'm brooding about something. But if I actually have that moment of, hey, wake up, then I'll take a shower in a whole different way. I'll sit down in the shower with my hands open and I'll try to explain to an alien what it feels like to have hot water droplets fall onto your body, right? I really get into the sensation of it. And it becomes incredibly pleasurable when you're paying attention to it to that degree. And then
Mhm.
I think of the millions of humans for whom a hot shower would have been something that only a king gets and only rarely, that it would have been such a pleasurable experience that they would have given almost anything to experience. And here I am in the shower, brooding about some argument I'm having in my head, totally missing that having a hot shower is a very rare and pleasurable human experience. And so I can have it's the same shower. It's literally the same shower in my house. And I can have an incredibly negative experience where I'm battling someone in my head or brooding about something, or I can really have almost a transcendent experience focusing on the pleasure of a hot shower and how rare it is in human history to be experiencing it. Two totally different experiences in the shower. The only difference was how much I was paying attention, how much I was awake during that. And I can do that with my children, and I can do that with doing the dishes, and I can do that even driving my car. It's so boring, I'm driving a car. Then I start thinking about there are sound waves that are hitting my ear and I experience that as music, and sometimes I don't like the music, it doesn't do anything, and then sometimes the music makes my body kind of wiggle in this weird way, and if I really pay attention to it, I am flying through space, and I'm in this car that I don't even understand how it works, I certainly couldn't build one, and sound waves are hitting my ear, and we're dancing in the car, and all of a sudden it becomes this really cool experience that I'm experiencing with my children, and just a moment ago, it was just a boring car ride. And so this is so much of what spirituality is and what it's done for me, especially separating it from religion, is really waking up to the preciousness of these moments. And it's really a big piece of what moved me from a place where wanting to die, where just instead then being just overwhelmed that I got the opportunity to be alive and to experience this not as a flower, but actually to experience this as a human where we get to talk about it. It's amazing. And you can just come to that place of awe and gratitude by learning how to cue yourself to wake up. And what that looks like is different for everyone.
Yeah, that's so beautiful. Thank you for that. And I think maybe you're right. We can't do it all the time. We can't always be that awake and aware because it's exhausting, right? We do need rest from it. So maybe we just start with one thing, and maybe we wake up in the morning and say, I'm going to find one thing today that I'm going to savor, or I'm going to see it differently, or I'm going to experience all of the senses of it. I'm going to describe those senses to myself so that I have that moment, so that it's sort of ingrained in me. And just one thing. And that's, I
Mhm.
think, a good place for our fellow revolutionaries to start, is just find one thing to have
Yeah.
awe about in a day and to see differently, and that can be your sandcastle for the day.
Mhm.
The other thing that you talked about that of course resonates with me as a mother is that, like, last time of picking up a child. And the sad thing about human experience is that I can't remember when the last time was that I picked up each of my children. And that's beautiful and sad, right? Because I've had so many experiences with them since then that were equally as meaningful and have sort of replaced that experience. And I'm going to continue to have those experiences and those memories and stuff. And I don't know, the last thing that I sort of come down to also is that, you know, you and I are somewhat allergic to truth claims, right? Or to anybody telling us how things are. And so for me, the next contemplation is like, okay, I can have these wonderful spiritual experiences out in nature where I touch the rocks and the trees and I look at everything and I feel the wind on my face. And I wonder if even that is a truth claim, that we're on a physical planet experiencing these things,
Mm.
and so that's sort of that's the next thing
Yeah.
to contemplate, like, down the road.
Yeah, that for that question, something that gives me a lot of peace when it comes to questions like that, where you're really challenging what's going on with reality, is that to me, the only thing that can't be an illusion is consciousness, which is that there's a quality to experience at all. That's the
Mm,
only thing that can't be an illusion, that
mhm,
there is a quality to experience. Now, we could still be um computer characters in some, Sims alien game. We There's so many things that could be possible about what's actually going on with reality. But the only thing that can't be an illusion is that we are experiencing something. That is there's Even if we're wrong about that, there's something to be wrong about, which just
yeah,
goes back to the fact that we're experiencing something. So that because of that kind of ground level, that there's something to the nature of experience and to the quality of experience, that gives us a place to have some ground to build from. That even if this is just, the sun coming through is just pixels on a computer game on some alien program, you're still having an experience with it. Something's happening in your body, something's resonating in your body. And so that to me gives me a lot of peace that I can still build that meaning and those experiences into my life and not have to know why that is the case, why we do that. I really don't know. I don't know if it's if our subconscious is just so complex that it's basically like a god. I don't know if we're on an alien computer. I don't know if we have a soul. I don't know any of that. But I do know that conversations like this fill my cup because for me, what you feel out in nature, I feel with words. And I don't
mm,
feel it out in nature. I actually don't spend a lot of time in nature. It
mhm,
doesn't move me the same way that words move me. So
Mm,
for me, this conversation, regardless of what is ultimately true, is so meaningful in the experience of it for me. And that can be true without any other truth claims. You don't have to believe any other thing about reality to just know that I prefer this experience to this experience. We can start there.
yeah.
And that helped me a lot because that really required no truth claims to start building my life. And I still do that. I don't hold to a lot of truth claims. I still have that allergy to truth claims. I may always do. And it doesn't mean that I'm right. It just means that I come from religious trauma and I'm very sensitive to truth claims.
Yeah.
But having that experience as your basis, you can build from there, even not knowing anything about what is ultimately true. And that was really helpful for me.
Yeah, that space of I don't know was a great space for me too. And I spent a lot of time there as I deconstructed. And almost every question that I asked myself or that someone else asked me, the answer was I don't know. And I still have a lot of those, but I love that space. I love the I don't know space because in Mormonism, we knew everything, right? We had an answer for everything. And I think a lot of religions do sort of have a pat answer. And then there are those other little things that I don't know, we don't really know, God will work it out kind of things. But I loved the idea of removing the surety from my life, even though it was really scary at first. Being able to consider other ideas as valid and as meaningful and as important was such a new space to me that I loved it. And I still do love
Mm,
it.
yeah.
Because in Mormonism, we would always say, "Oh, aren't you cute? You have some of the ideas, but they're not all correct, and we're the
It's
only
so
ones that have
condescending,
all."
right?
It is so condescending and how horrible of the hubris that is and how much it
Yes.
prevents us from learning and growing as human beings. I loved that I don't know space,
That's a
and I
good
feel in it.
Yeah, that's a good shift for truth seekers to make because if you're a truth seeker by nature or by core value, and then you find that there really isn't a lot of truth to be had, that can be really disorienting. And so if you change that truth seeking because there's ultimate truth and I'm going to find it, if you change that into this is my favorite game where hey, this is what I'm, going on with reality with me. What's going on with your reality? What do you think is going on with reality? That's essentially how you and I are playing right now, right? Like
Mhm.
we're flying through space and we have these bodies and we're trying to figure out what's going on. And even though we're in this place where it's just a lot of I don't know, we're still both finding joy in this new game, which is I really love just playing what the hell is going on with reality. Let's talk about it. That's a new game that can be enjoyable too once you shift away from there having to be truth in order to play that game.
Yeah. So you've brought us all the way back around, I think, to the truth telling, truth asking question. And where I think I would like to sort of wrap up this part of our conversation is the contemplation of is it worth it?
Mm,
Considering everything we've talked about, where some people are much safer with the construct of religion and with the construct of sort of having answers to things, knowing how problematic that is for some people. And then where we've been in a space of truth telling, where some of our truths are really uncomfortable and they can be really hurtful to other people and other people's experience. Is it worth it to consider that your worldview may be completely false and that you need to completely tear it down in order to exist authentically as a human being? I think you and I have answered that question for ourselves, but what about other people?
mm. Yeah, I think about this a lot, a lot, a lot, a lot, especially as I consider the ethics of the kinds of things that I talk about publicly and the kind of coaching that I do. I think about this all the time. I could sit down for the rest of the day and talk about this with you. Um, when I was first leaving when I was first leaving religion, and truth really mattered to me and I figured that it mattered for everyone else too. I was like, "Oh, I'll just tell everybody what's going on with Joseph Smith and they'll understand," right? Like let's just like I'm just trying to burn bridges left, right, and center. And I was really under this apprehension that like just burn this down. Like we can do better than this. None of this is true. And I've learned a lot since then. And one of the things that really changed me was a friend of mine going through a faith crisis, and attempting suicide. And I started to dig in more to human psychology and how much we can handle. And I learned some things that changed my views on how aggressive I want to be with some of these things. So, for example, people who tend towards fundamentalism have a higher need for closure. They need it more to psychologically function, just to get out of the bed. They need a little bit more surety and a little less chaos. For
Mm.
some people, also, religious community is a part of how they've survived something. So I feel like it would be unethical for me as a white educated woman to walk into the deep south and say Jesus isn't coming. There's something that feels unethical about that because this people who survived slavery by bonding over this idea of retributive justice, and that there would be that someone cared that
Yeah.
there was slavery and the injustices of slavery. And it feels unethical also when we look at exposure therapy. So if you were afraid of spiders and I put a spider on your lap without your consent, you would be more afraid of spiders after that session. But
Mhm.
if you consented and said, I'm going to work on my fear of spiders, that's actually the only way to remove your fear of spiders. Is with a therapist, you look at a picture of a spider and you get a little closer, and then a spider in a cage across the room, and then you move a little bit closer, and over time you do exposure therapy to things that are really scary to you. And so I have to remember that I didn't get to where I am overnight. I slowly deconstructed over 20 years because our brain can only handle about a 1% change of worldview at a time. We can't physically do more than that. You cannot reorganize your brain and all of the neural pathways that you have overnight. To expect that someone to do that is like being mad at a baby for not running. Like, they physically cannot. And so for a lot of reasons, and there's a lot more reasons, but for a lot of reasons, I've been more cautious about the wisdom of someone's subconscious when something is really scary for them. I've had people come up to me and say, like, there's something about you that, like, brings up fear and brings up feelings in them when I'm around them. And I appreciate that they could say that out loud. And so I think there's wisdom sometimes in our subconscious saying, I'm not going to go there because I don't think that I could handle it. Sometimes our subconscious is making that decision, and
Mm.
maybe it's wise that it's doing so. And so when it comes to, if we have to choose between truth and well-being, I think everybody has to make this choice. I used to say truth. I now say well-being. That if this truth is going to cause you to kill yourself and put untold trauma throughout your story and your children's genetics for generations, that I choose well-being, which is what is, I want religion to get better for the people who need it. And because at one time I did too. At one time, the things that I'm saying now wouldn't have resonated to me when I was so entrenched in Mormonism. I couldn't have even understood this conversation at all. So I'm much more generous now with the idea that sometimes being an atheist is a privilege. It's an education privilege. It's a privilege that you can even exist outside of your religious community. There's a lot of privileges that can go on with being an atheist. I'm more aware of people's psychology. I'm more aware of the wisdom of people's subconscious, and I'm more ethically aware of people need to consent to this. They can't be pushed here, or they're going to cling harder to whatever security blankets that they have because you've scared them in a way that they didn't consent to. So it's a lot more complex for me now. For now, I really meet people, when I'm one-on-one, I don't, I really just go with however much they're consenting to go with me. And then publicly, I try to be a little bit careful that if I'm ever kind of blowing up someone's worldview, dropping some hard truths, that I always follow it up with tools that will help, or else I think that it's unethical.
Mm.
Because I think there's something hard about Christians saying, I don't care that you're going to suffer in hell forever. This is the truth. But there's something equally icky about an atheist saying, I don't care if you're going to kill yourself. If you find this out, this is the truth. And so I don't care. Like,
Mm.
I want to care. I want to care. And for people like my brother, who's an addict, and he found Jesus as part of his recovery. Statistically, it would be a threat to his sobriety to go through as much deconstruction as I did, where you're completely psychologically unhinged. You have to
Yeah.
have a lot of privilege to get through that space, especially if you're an addict and you have that history. And so I want religion to get better for him, because helpful truths that tend towards well-being to me are more important than truths that I don't even know are true. I don't even know if if what I think is true is ultimately true. So why am I going to kill someone over it? I
Yeah.
I think that we can have better tools to deal with, harsh truths and still come out the other side with well-being. I am still dedicated to that path because that was my path and I want to help people on that path. But I am not now so prideful to say that that path is the best for everyone.
Yeah. Thank you for that, because we are so individual. Our minds are so complicated. And what worked for us, we can, like you say, give some helpful tools or we can give some guidance. But ultimately, it's going to be so different for every person. And I've often said, that I don't ever want my parents to leave the church, because I don't think that psychologically they could really handle the burden of that. And that kind of brings me around to another little point that we can consider here at the end for fellow truth tellers out there. I know this has happened to you, it's happened to me. We get a lot of anger that comes our way when we say these uncomfortable truths. And I always want to dig down a little bit and to help people understand that anger usually comes from a secondary place like shame or fear. And a lot of the truths that we tell kind of confront people's dearly held beliefs or their their pills or their drugs or their comforts or whatever. And so I think under that anger is some fear and maybe also some shame over having believed for a long time. Can you talk a little bit about how you deal with people who come at you with anger for being a truth teller?
Yeah, so you're right. I do get this a lot, and the thing that really allows me to be in a space where I'm getting a lot of heat all the time is really understanding the brain psychology of what's going on with them. So the example I use is if a 10-year-old kid comes over and starts kicking you in the shins, you'd say, "What the heck? Like, stop it. What are you doing?" You could even get angry. But if the mother comes over and says, "I'm sorry, my child has autism. There was just a really loud noise. He's really struggling." Instantly, because I now understand this child, I no longer care that they're kicking my shins, and I'm willing to help, and I've forgotten all about it. I'm no longer angry because I understand what's going on with this kid in a way that drives my compassion. And so we can do the same thing when we get that identity response for people, that if your truths and beliefs are attached to your identity, meaning your beliefs give you a sense of who you are and your life and your values and your foundation and your marriage and your relationship and your beliefs and your morality, and literally everything about you is attached to your beliefs, then if I say something that attacks your beliefs, essentially to your subconscious, I'm saying, you are no one. And what you've built your life on isn't true, so you're nothing. Like, that's what I'm saying to their subconscious brain. You are nothing. So of course, there is literally nothing else that your ego brain is going to do except double down and defend the things that are threatening your identity and your belonging and literally every the foundation of everything about you, because your subconscious knows that to redo that is going to suck. And in the case of being evolutionary creatures, to leave your tribe is literally death. It feels like dying. So having compassion and understanding that whatever I said hit something in their identity, and they now need to defend their self-worth and their identity by saying something back to me, is the same as the kid kicking my shins. Like, I don't necessarily like it, but I really deeply understand why you need to do this. Deeply understand why you need to do this. And I remember being in that place, and I understand the religious brain, and I understand your need to defend your identity and everything about you, and that unless you know that that's what your brain is doing, there's no other choice for your brain to do than to just do that double down thing. And so to me, the more understanding that we can have for human nature increases our capacity for compassion. And then we can say the things that we feel called to say just because, this is our authentic truth. And part of, what gives us meaning and purpose is to have these kinds of conversations. And, if I get emails after this saying that I'm going to go to hell, I don't necessarily like them. They don't really make my day, but I really understand why you felt like you need to send that email. And then that makes it um, tolerable, I guess I should say.
Yeah. And so for those who are considering the possibility of deconstruction on one level or another, or considering the possibility of diving into some of these harder questions, I guess it's a contemplation of how much do you think you can handle, and maybe making some small, slow changes little by little. And also the realization that a lot of people don't really understand is that, when you or I or anybody else sort of challenges somebody's worldview or their beliefs, they feel like we're bringing a burning torch into a forest, into a pine forest. And what some people don't understand is that forest fires are necessary. They're cleansing, they're
Mm.
healing, because they burn out all this undergrowth that's taking up energy and resources. And what happens is when a natural forest fire occurs, is that all of that undergrowth gets burnt down, and then underneath the ashes, more new growth comes up. And the trees that survive the fire are stronger and more able to continue to grow than the trees that don't survive it. And so when I look at it sort of like that like when the forest fire comes, like not all the trees survive, but what comes after it is this beautiful new growth. And it's a terrible and a beautiful contemplation at the same time. So it's hard.
Yeah. It is hard because you can't push you can't I do think it's unethical to just push someone there because
Yeah.
when you're talking about a forest fire, in hindsight, both of us can look back and say, "Oh, there's some beautiful undergrowth happening because of this forest fire." But when we were both in it, it feels like you're dying. Like you are
Yeah.
dying. Your identity is dying. Like
Yeah.
you are dead. You are walking around dead during that
Mhm.
time. You're on fire, you're dying. And so I think we need to give more words to that space because if someone um, would have been able to hold my hand in this space and say, "Oh, here's some language for the existential fears that you're facing. You're going through a forest fire, but here's some of the undergrowth possibilities that are just around the corner. It feels like you're dying because your identity is dying, but the beautiful thing is you're going to be able to consider ideas in the future so much more freely because you're not attaching your identity to certain truth claims anymore. And that's just going to give you so much more freedom and joy." If someone could have shown me some of those things, that really would have helped me because at the time I felt like I'm dead and I'm always going to be dead. Like I'm just dead now. Like I'm just going through the motions and keeping my children alive, but inside I'm dead. And now I have a lot more language for how beautiful that space is and how beautiful that death is. But I don't think that we have to do that totally alone without language and conversations and other people who have gone through it and story. Um, we can go through that forest fire. I think knowing that it's a forest fire, that's not going to entirely kill us, but it's going to change us. And that's what I try to do now, just because I hope it makes that journey a little bit easier for one other person.
And it did certainly for me. And this actually brings us all the way for full circle, because that's where I found you on Mormon Stories, and you gave me language for everything I was going through existentially at that time, or I had already contemplated but wasn't sure how to talk about or how to frame. So can you please, for everybody else out there, tell them how they can find you and plug all the things you do?
Sure. So my book, No Nonsense Spirituality, is on Amazon. I am on TikTok. I've taken the summer off to be home with my children, but I'll be back to TikTok soon. I'm hoping to start a YouTube channel to talk about like specific tools for when you're in this place, which would have been really helpful for me if I could have just had short little videos to help me give glimpses to what was going on with me during that time, and tools to help. So I hope to start that soon. And on social media, I'm just always under No Nonsense Spirituality. And yeah, I really have enjoyed this conversation with you today. We had some beautiful emotional resonances, and we just went to some really beautiful places.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. I don't know how many people have seen this movie, but Peter Pan with Robin Williams, and he's sort of like in this play space where he goes back to be Peter Pan, and then it's time to go home, and the game is over, and the kid says to him, "That was a great game," and that's how I feel about this today.
That was perfect. I love that.